Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip, and today we have Bruce Porter. He's the author of Destroying the Shadow Agenda. Sounds like some conspiracy type literature there, but it's not. This is about how the values that America was built on and how this country has moved away from these values. And so, Bruce, thank you for being here.
It's an honor to be with you.
Now, Bruce is a firefighter. He was also a chaplain, and he was also sent from, what was it? Where were you stationed?
In Morrison, Colorado.
Morrison, Colorado, and sent with permission to the ground zero of 9/11 to help with some of the trauma, right? Or help people with trauma. So, first off, tell us about a bit of your experience. I understand that it was that experience that inspired you to write this book. Is that right?
It was. One day I was standing on the rubble pile, kind of looking around and taking in, the trauma of that event and the people around me that were suffering. And a question came to me in a really strong way and said, how did you get here, America? How did we come to this place? And for the last 10 years that I've been working on this book and finally finished it last year, I spent my time trying to answer that question. And then the follow-on question, how did we get here, is how do we get back to where our founders originally established our country? And that was an adventure, I want to tell you. It was a wild ride through the early history of our country, the founding fathers, their writings, trips to New York to do research on some of the sites that were there and some things I could learn. And it's become just almost an obsession with me to answer that question for other people through the book and to bring us to a place where we can see the beauty of our Constitution, the beauty of the Bill of Rights, and the very real and I think inevitable likelihood that we are going to come back to a place of national sanity again in spite of everything we hear around us.
Let's hope. I feel it too, but let's keep our fingers crossed. Right?
Absolutely.
So what is the shadow agenda you refer to?
The shadow agenda specifically is, and this is where the conspiracy seems to come in, okay, I'll give you that up front. There's a demonic kind of conspiracy in the unseen realm that Paul described when he said, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities and spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. And that human beings are being influenced, either for good or for evil, depending on what they yield themselves to. And that there are significant numbers of people in the world today that are yielding themselves to these darker angels, for lack of a better term. People are giving their willing assent to cooperating with these malicious beings that literally want to enslave mankind and destroy humanity.
Yeah, well, a few points on this. So Epoch Times, we've recently published a editorial series called The Specter of Communism is Ruling Our World. And this is a very similar point that we make, that there is of course we point to communism and socialism, that this is, people often think of it just as a economic argument, right? Basically an alternate economic system, which goes much far beyond that. The idea that socialism was built on, right, is to not just seize the means of production. People think it means get rid of capitalism. It gets rid of private ownership of business. It doesn't get rid of any of the problems people think they see in capitalism. But it very specifically targets beliefs, morality. It targets the family structure. It targets people's ability to govern themselves. And it targets every value and tradition that every country is based on, including the United States. And it's an interesting point you made that this ties back to the founding of this country, because America was a country built for a free people, built around an idea of self-governance. And it was an experiment in self-governance. But that self-governance was made for a moral people.
Yes.
And so what happens when those morals are attacked, right?
Exactly.
This is a really interesting point you're making here, I think.
Exactly. If you trace back the source of our troubles today with communism and look at the life of Karl Marx, Karl Marx was, by some estimations, a Satanist. In fact, one of the things that's distinctive about his image is the big beard that you often see on these early communists in the late 1700s and 1800s. And what a lot of people aren't aware of, and I did some research on this in the book, Karl Marx was raised in a Christian family. He quoted Bible verses. He wrote some of the most beautiful Christian poetry that you'll ever read. And yet in college, he came in under the influence of a Bruno Bauer, who was an ardent socialist, and he asked him a singular question: why is there evil in the world if God is good? And he couldn't answer it. He had no theological understanding of why things happen in the world the way they do. And he became resentful of God. In fact, more than that, he became a hater of God. And then his later literature that he wrote was just vicious in his vitriol against this creator that he hated so much. And so he devised the Communist Manifesto around that theme that humans must save themselves, without God.
And this is an interesting point. You mentioned that he came across this idea that questioned if God is good, then why does bad things happen in the world? That was the original heresy.
Indeed.
That was from the Manichaeans.
Yes, it was.
Which was behind a lot of the witchcraft movement.
Exactly.
That was the basis of Satanism. Indeed. Actually, and it's funny when you talk about this, because people think these days, oh, you're talking about stuff, maybe some people don't believe in it. But whether you believe it or not, this is history.
This is history. This is what they believed.
And so basically the basis of the Manichaeans was that, if everything is from God, then how does evil come about if God created it, right? Mm-hmm. That, they called God the names and things like this. They trashed the name of God.
The greatest villain in the universe.
Yeah. So, anyways, I think they missed the point. Is that I think that one of the foundations of religion, not just in the East, not just in the West, but in the East as well, was that the hardships in life are trials for our souls, right? It is the difficulties in life that test our hearts and allow us to choose good or evil, right? It's not to come here and live in peace and harmony and have no problems. It's to come here and be among people who share the same free will as we do, and in that environment to be tested to see which path we decide to take, right?
Well, however you may interpret it, evil is. It does happen, and we know that God is God and that He's in charge of everything. But here's the thing, that's the bottom line to it all. Nothing happens by accident. Nothing takes place in the world purposelessly, that there's no purpose to it. And this is, I think, the despair that so many people have when they suffer, because they see suffering or they experience it, and they can't see any why or rhyme or reason for it. And then they begin to blame God, and they begin to say, well, why did you do this to me? Why did you allow this? Which Karl Marx did.
Yeah, and so under Marx, we have a system where he talked about, right, communism. Communism doesn't just aim to, seize control of all forms of wealth and ownership and these things, but also to destroy tradition, morality, the family.
Exactly.
You name it. And we see this today in countries like communist China, where just about every organized religion is being persecuted in some way, some extremely harshly.
Right.
Including religions that are, I think the new left protects, like Islam. You look at the Muslim Uyghurs, they're living in concentration camps.
Right. Exactly.
And somehow the world turns a blind eye to this religious abuse. Yes. And they don't draw the line, they don't draw the connection that this is something that communism calls for, right? But it's an interesting state you mentioned that, maybe we can come back from this as well.
Yes.
And also the idea that this is something that in the West, even without being under, say, a full communist system, has in fact affected the moral values of the West.
Yes.
And so can you tell us about what you kind of came across with that?
Well, communism is based upon the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The idea that there's an elite class that can, run everything. And one of the things that we see in all socialist systems is that they make government into God. And the idea of individualism, or the idea of individual goodness is suppressed under these rules and regulations that the government dictates on every person. And it's an ancient kind of thing that's happened. I mean, even back in Roman times, Christians were not being persecuted because they were dishonest in business or that they were immoral people in the society. They refused to acknowledge Caesar as Lord. They refused to give a small pinch of incense to Caesar as being supreme over this dead Galilean they thought was, and the Christians were, of course, saying, this guy is Lord. Jesus is Lord. He's Lord over Caesar. And now in China, as you mentioned, China cannot tolerate in their governmental system, in socialism and communism, any idea that someone or something is superior to the government. That the government then has to be all pervasive, all controlling, all knowing.
Because if people acknowledge that there's a power higher than government, it means that there are values the government does not control.
Exactly.
And if people recognize values that the government violates, right,
Yes,
then they no longer recognize the authority of government.
Right.
Which is the big problem communism has always run into, which is why it's always persecuted good people in every society it's gone to, really. When people believe in morals higher than the state cannot control them, fully. It can't dominate them the way it would like to.
And control is the issue. It is the issue. Really, it's the issue of every humanistic person, that grasping for the levers and the buttons to push and the wheels to turn to make life go the way they think it should go. And the idea of surrendering to a supernatural being that we call God or Christ, ruling and having lordship over our lives, it's a huge leap for some people to take because we are so fearful. And when you look at these governments and you look at socialism, even in this country among the left, they're terrified that there might be a being that they one day will have to answer to, that they will have accountability to. And yet it's the greatest thing that could ever happen to them, of course, but humanistic man always looks for the levers, the control. And it's scary for them when they feel like they're out of control. And I think that's the appeal to leftism or even Marxism as we have it today, is that so many people refuse to submit themselves to higher authority unless they are the authority, because then that control is in full expression. And they feel like, okay, now I can have my way, either through the government or making laws or forcing on other people, my values. And let's face it, everybody has values. The question is, where do we get them? Do we make them up according to our fleshly desires, our whimsical, lust, our avarice, our desire for wealth and power, and everything becomes just expediency? Or do we govern our lives by a higher law? And I think this is what the founders really had. This was their genius. The founders of our great country had a clear understanding, clearer than our leaders today, unfortunately, that God rules nations, and that the principles that they set forth were taken almost directly from some of the sermon notes of the preachers of their time, because they were calling for people to be governed by God, to be governed by His moral precepts and how well that works when it's in play. And so I'm convinced, and I'm kind of a post-millennialist from that standpoint. I believe that we're going to come into eventually a time when Christ's rule will be over all the earth. The famous song by Handel, and He shall reign forever and ever and ever and ever. And I believe that one day that will come into full expression. Not because you and I are clever enough to make it happen, or that any human agency can engineer that, but by Him working in the hearts and in the minds and in the spirits of humans who are being influenced by Him. And these, of course, are the higher angels that God is calling people to.
Yeah, well, a couple points. We mentioned, of course, the idea of communism's kind of war on morality, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I think people who have watched the show know that I've talked before. I call the modern socialist moral system the morality of immorality. And here's how it works. The basis of a lot of the communist ideas, right, the older ones, were in naturism, which you could say is a Luciferian or satanic concept. The idea they went by is that nature is holy and righteous. We're all of nature, so anything that emerges from you is therefore righteous, right? Anything that emerges from human
Right.
nature. Any desire, any whim, any feeling, right? You follow it. And anything that tries to restrain that is evil. And so they believe that good is evil and evil is good. Morals, things that we use to restrain our desires and our character, right, are things that they view as things that should be destroyed.
Yes.
And if you look at society today, that's exactly what it is. It is not the people who do whatever they feel like who are considered wrong. It is the people who say that it is wrong to do whatever you feel like who are considered wrong.
Right.
You see, it's flipped upside down.
It is, yeah, it's an inverted thing.
And another important point too, as you mentioned, individuality. It's funny that a lot of the kind of socialist side, they think that individualism is what they stand for, but it is not.
No,
they stand for collectivism, which are absolutely opposed to each other.
The antithesis of true individualism.
And the original socialists, they did not believe in free will, which was also a concept of the old Gnostics and kind of Luciferian sects. They did not acknowledge free will, right? Which was the whole concept, as you mentioned, that Marx got into of, why is evil allowed to happen in the world, right? They called God the demiurge.
Yeah, the demiurge, exactly, yeah.
And it was based on the idea that there is no free will. Because if there was, and if there's no free will, then why are some people destined to commit evil? Why, the fact that good and evil things happen to good people is because is because people decide to do evil. They don't acknowledge the existence of free will. Otherwise, how could a person choose to do wrong to another person, right?
We're swimming in the deeper side of the swimming pool here theologically, and you raised some interesting points there. For myself, I believe every person has a will, everyone. How free it is the question. If you're raised all your life in lies, if you've been indoctrinated by the public school system, for example, that whatever, I mean, if you're indoctrinated in college that you're a racist just because of the color of your skin, or you're a woman hater just because you celebrate masculinity, or whatever the issue is, people in that state, and I mean, let's face it, we don't have all the facts in any of our lives. We have a will and we exercise it to the best of the knowledge that we have, the light that we walk in. So, I agree, everybody has a will. Marx had a will, Adam had a will. He exercised it. Look what happened to human beings from that time on. I think from that time on, the will got twisted. It got in bondage. It was unable to clearly make righteous, good decisions, productive decisions, helpful decisions, because of that underlying nature that twists our will and makes us want things that really we shouldn't maybe want. And that's the problem we have right now with education, is that so many generations of young people are coming out of the school systems with a very twisted, in fact, twisted is actually the word we use for wicked, a very wicked understanding of life and of our purpose as human beings.
Yeah, and I would say that this is part of the, ideological and spiritual slavery that communism represents.
It is.
And one of the main reasons why it seeks so hard to destroy our memory of the past, to destroy our books, to destroy our faith, to destroy our culture, to destroy everything that our values are based upon.
Exactly.
Because as long as people remember what was lost, they remember how to go back to it.
Yeah.
But I would say that even among those who do not remember how to go back, they feel it. And you can see that in the rampant depression, I think, that a lot of people feel these days. That people turn to drugs and alcohol and they can't sleep at night. And they feel sad and they don't know why, right? I would say it is because they are missing something, and they know they are missing something, and society is not providing them with that peace, right?
I call it the fading background radiation of rationality. That people, as we've gone further and further into this idea of, no morality or amorality in our country, our sanity is being affected. And when you talk to some people, as I'm sure you have, about the Christian gospel, for example, their reactions are often irrational. They can't put logic to what they're arguing because they don't like how it feels. And that feeling thing is almost bigger than their brain. And I think you make a really important point there, you know, that we've endured a mass brainwashing. We really have. I devoted a chapter in my book called America's Frontal Lobotomy, that over the past 100 years we've endured an intellectual and a spiritual frontal lobotomy, in that we are forgetting who we were. We're forgetting who we were meant to be. That the national destiny of our nation, I believe, was established by God. One of the big thrills I had when I was at Ground Zero was I was invited to go over to St. Paul's Chapel, which is in that southern area there, just adjacent to the Ground Zero rubble. And I went inside there, and I was invited by someone who had some medical practices, and they had some food, and they had some things for rescue workers. And I had a podiatrist walk over to me and ask me, "Hey, would you like to have a foot examination because your feet are getting beat up out there on the rubble?" I said, "Sure." So I sat down in this booth, and a nurse began working on my feet. The doctor came over, looked at it, and she looked up at me and she said, "Do you know where you're sitting?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm in a church. I'm not." "What do you mean?" She said, "You're sitting in George Washington's prayer booth, where he came after his inauguration in 1789 and prayed for 3 hours for America." And I got goosebumps on my goosebumps when I realized where I was sitting, the historical significance of that point in geography. And to realize how deep their faith was, that they weren't all deists as we're being told, but many of these people were pastors, and many of the signers of the Declaration were people with seminary degrees, that their love of God transcended even their political aspirations. And that gave me great hope, because I thought, okay, God, if you began something like this, surely you're going to finish it. That somewhere down the line there's going to be a turning. Maybe after a lot of rough, level 5 rapids, we're going to maybe come out to a place where you're going to manifest something in the lives and hearts of people, some of whom are going to be the least likely persons that we would imagine would ever have a conversion experience. And we're going to see something that's going to be so wonderful. And that's the flavor of everything I write about, is that I don't think we're headed for destruction. I think we're going through rough times, but I think there's a bigger destiny in play, and I'm very, very excited about it.
Great. So again, this is Bruce Porter, author of Destroying the Shadow Agenda.
A Christian Manifesto.
There you go. Great. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Pleasure to
Thank
be
you.
with you. Thank you so much.
And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.